Inside the diner where I had been called by a familiar name for 25 years, the whole room suddenly held its breath when I walked in, and Brenda, who once brought me coffee every morning, looked straight at me and said, "You really are confused now, aren't you, Mr. Colt?" One sentence, enough to make the whole community turn its back, enough to turn me into someone losing his mind, right inside my own life. I stood there, hearing spoons freeze in midair, hearing a few people whisper that I should go to a nursing home, and realizing that my son's first blow wasn't in any court record, but right here, in the place where I had once been treated like family. If you've ever seen someone smeared in public, leave a... So I'll know you understand that feeling. And if you want to keep walking with me through these small stories of everyday justice, your subscription would be something I truly cherish. The night in Silver Pine Ridge carries a kind of wind unlike anywhere else. Cold but not biting, just enough to send a shiver through those who have lived with it for decades. The warm yellow lights from the wooden cabins along the hillside spill down onto the main road, patchy like old fragments of memory. I, Raymond Colt, still drive my old Jeep into town every Friday night, just to sit in the exact wooden seat by the window at Pine Lantern Diner, where Helena and I once had breakfast for 25 years. But tonight, the moment my hand touched the door handle, the air in the diner shifted entirely. Conversations fell silent as if someone had flipped a switch. The neon lights reflected off the glass, illuminating every face that was trying not to look at me. Brenda, the owner, who once called me Ray with that long, familiar drawl, set the coffee pot down hard on the counter, as if she hadn't known me for a quarter of a century. I stepped inside. The door chime rang, but instead of greetings, the whole room paused for a few seconds. Brenda looked up. "Mr. Colt," she said, her voice cold and distant, as if speaking to a stranger who had wandered into the wrong place. "No more calling me Ray. No more the familiar, the usual, sir. Just stiff form of address, so formal." I briefly turned my head, thinking she must be speaking to someone else. The people in the diner looked at me with a kind of pity, more pity than welcome. An old man at table number 3 lowered his head toward his cocoa, but I still heard him whisper to his wife, "See, just like what they said on the Silver Pine Community Group. He really shouldn't be living alone anymore." I froze. Last night, Lydia, the wife of my son, posted a long message in the community group, a post full of concern about a father-in-law with declining memory, prone to getting lost, with many unusual behaviors. The post even attached a secretly taken photo of me from behind while I was pushing a cart in the supermarket, with a caption, "If anyone saw him standing at the forest edge for hours last night, it wasn't his fault. Old age, you know." I had never stood at the forest edge. I had never gotten lost. I had only stopped the car to check the route map for the next day's photo hunting trip. But to Lydia, that was enough to turn me into a pitiful character in the story she was crafting. Inside the diner, the whispering began to rise as if they were no longer trying to hide it. Poor thing. After Helena passed, he has no one to look after him. I heard the son is planning to ask the court to intervene. Yeah, leaving him like that is dangerous. I clenched my hand on the edge of the table. When Brenda set the cup of coffee in front of me, the coffee spilled over, but she didn't wipe it like she always did. Just one sentence. "Are you all right, Mr. Colt?" The way she pressed on "Mr." felt like a dull knife cutting into the softest part of me. I left the diner early, didn't say goodbye. On the way home, snow suddenly began to fall lightly. White flecks teased the headlights, as if reminding me that the place that once belonged to me was now growing cold in its own way. When I reached the wooden house on the hill, the one Helena and I had built with our own hands, beam by beam, I saw an envelope taped to the door, a summons, from the Silver Pine County Court. I stood on the porch, snow falling into my collar, my hand trembling, but not from the cold. In the document, Ethan, my son, petitioned the court to declare me incapacitated, and demanded $850,000, claiming a family investment that the father had promised but can no longer remember to fulfill. One final sentence choked me. My father's erratic behavior and cognitive decline are becoming a danger to himself and to the family's assets. I closed my eyes. They had finished everything, shaped public opinion in the town, sowed doubt, set the trap so that just one moment of anger from me would be enough to deem me unstable. I leaned against the icy door, and I understood. I wasn't just being betrayed, I was being prepared to be buried alive in silence before the trial even began. I sat alone in the kitchen Helena had loved most, where the morning light slipped through the small window like a soft golden thread. Since she passed, that corner had never truly brightened again. Some people leave not just a space, but take with them the light of the house itself. Helena was the one who kept this family balanced, who kept both me and Darren from sliding down slopes I had always mistaken for harmless. She never scolded, never raised her voice, but all she had to do was square her shoulders, and Darren immediately knew he was wrong. I once thought it was a mother's instinct, but the older I grew, the more I understood. Helena saw in the boy things I didn't dare face. I remember when Darren had credit card debt after college. Not large, but enough to scare him. I paid it off for him, sneaking around like some criminal hiding a sin from his wife, thinking I was being a good father. Helena only sighed. Ray, he needs to learn to pay for his mistakes, not get used to having them erased. I didn't listen. Then came the time I co-signed his first apartment. Darren overspent, came up short, and I signed again. I said it was helping him get started, while Helena looked at me with eyes that made me understand I was laying the first brick on the path that would make him addicted to leaning on others. Then came the wedding money. Darren said it was just a temporary loan. I gave it to him, knowing full well I would never see a dollar back. But what never left my mind was what happened 12 years ago. Darren was called in by the company for falsifying work reports, altering hours to receive extra stipends, an act not serious enough to be arrested, but enough to lose his job. I panicked, scrambling for ways to soften the consequences, while Helena walked straight in and said, "Stop. No one is covering this up for him, not even you." The next day, she personally took Darren to HR, had him write a statement, return the entire fraudulent amount, and accept the disciplinary action. Darren cried in the car on the way home, and I wanted to hold him, comfort him, give him a way out. Helena placed a hand on my shoulder. Your son is not bad, but he won't know boundaries if no one holds them for him. Many years later, I finally understood that. When Helena died in 2018, the afternoon wind on Silver Pine Ridge blew hard enough to shake our wedding photo. From the moment she left, everything that still stood in this house began to tilt. No one asked Darren where his money came from. No one demanded explanations. No one looked him in the eyes and said, no. I became the only weak point he could lean on, and worse, the only person he could exploit without fear of limits. The temporary loans piled up, stories about the company delaying paychecks, the car breaking down unexpectedly, a banking system glitch, came as regularly as monsoon winds. Every time I reached out to catch him, I thought it was love, but now I understand. It was how I nurtured the corruption growing inside him. Sitting in the kitchen Helena had kept so orderly, I remembered a winter evening in 1991. She set a thick folder on the table. "Ray," she said, "I set up a trust." I asked what trust. She replied, "A trust for the future. I don't want Darren to have access to a large sum of money impulsively. Our son is good, but not mature enough to hold on to many things. Someday, your leniency will cause him to fall." I laughed then. I told her she worried too much. Now, thinking back, Helena wasn't just looking ahead. She was seeing through everything. The whole kitchen suddenly made the truth clear. For 20 years, I didn't raise Darren into adulthood. I only shielded every consequence. What gnaws at me most is what happened right after Helena's first death anniversary. Darren came to me with a stricken face, saying the company was conducting an internal financial review, and he had misplaced some important documents. I knew instantly what it was. Another unnamed amount he had withdrawn from the advance fund, hoping to replace it before the audit. I said nothing, just drove him to an accountant friend, trying to negotiate extra time for him to repay without the file being escalated to the board. That night, I saw in his eyes not gratitude, but a frightening certainty that I would always rescue him. That moment chilled me. I had become the lifebuoy he threw out whenever his mistakes were about to surface. That incident didn't make him pause. Instead, Darren began acting as if my money were a natural part of his future. He spoke of the house my wife and I will live in someday, of the investment Dad once promised, of the family arrangements. What began as hints turned into open demands and eventually transformed into anger when I said no for the first time. That refusal shattered the entire world he had built on my past indulgence. And that was when Darren slid to the point of no return. He met with a lawyer, built a story that I was cognitively declining, collected every small action of mine as evidence, and submitted to the court a petition nearly 30 pages long. Now he is suing me, demanding $850,000, asking the court to declare me incapacitated. I cannot blame him. I am part of the cause. And in this suffocatingly silent Silver Pine night, the most painful thing is not the betrayal, but realizing it was my own hands that raised the shadow, now turning back to swallow me. That evening, Silver Pine Ridge carried the damp chill of late autumn, mist hanging low, yellow streetlights bleeding into blurred streaks. I sat alone in the kitchen, the court papers in front of me and my phone face down. The house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum and click off, like a breath trying to hold something back. I knew that the moment I turned the phone over, the rest of my life would no longer be the same. Eventually, I turned it on. Silver Pine Community Group had 37 new notifications. I tapped it. Lydia's post was at the top, her worried tone polished enough to fool people who had known me for decades. My father-in-law is showing signs of confusion, getting lost, forgetting to turn off the stove. I fear for him and for the community. Anyone who has seen anything unusual, please share. The attached photo was one she had taken of me from behind, inside Pine Lantern Diner. My back slightly hunched, gray jacket, neon light reflecting in a way that made me look far more lost than I ever was. A few comments appeared beneath it. Some said they'd seen me standing a little too long in the parking lot. Someone else said I gave the wrong date at the supermarket. Small stories lightly blown. Nothing dramatic, but just enough to plant one idea. Old Ray isn't quite the same. That alone was enough to shift the image of an elderly man living alone. I didn't need to read more. I turned off the screen and set it on the table. The kitchen returned to the ticking of the clock, as if it too were watching to see whether I was confused. The next morning I drove down to town. The familiar winding road through the pines lay still under a thin layer of mist. I still remember every pothole, every slick bend. The confused old man they talked about drove better than many young folks who had just gotten their license. The convenience store glowed as usual, but the change wasn't in the lights, it was in the eyes. The young clerk who used to chat with me about generators kept his head down today, offering only one polite line. His voice was strange enough that it slowed me half a beat. He was trying to speak gently to someone he believed had a fragile mind. I placed a few items on the counter. He took the receipt without looking at me, without calling me Mr. Ray like he always did. Just by changing how he addressed me, I knew he'd seen Lydia's post. A familiarity quietly unhooked without anyone needing force. As I stepped outside, I saw Agnes Winter's house across the street. That woman had been beside my family for more than 40 years. When Helena died, it was Agnes who left soup at my door for an entire month. Today, her curtain shifted. A silhouette stood behind it. I recognized Agnes instantly. She lifted the curtain a few inches and looked at me. Her eyes were hesitant, complicated. Then slowly, the curtain fell shut. A simple closing of the drapes, yet it changed the air of the whole street. I knew she had read the post, and though she said nothing, I could feel the thin boundary rising between us. Quiet, polite, but real. In the afternoon, I stopped by the gas station at the edge of town. Hank and two familiar men were talking. When they saw my car pull in, they fell silent. No one looked at me directly. I hooked the pump myself, listening to the wind run through the line of promotional flags. One of the men spoke in a low voice, pretending it was casual. He shouldn't be driving alone anymore. What if he hits the wrong pedal? The words were light, but enough to place me in the role of an old man who might cause an accident. Small stories, small gestures, small silences. Together they formed a new version of me, written by someone else. Lydia didn't need to shout or fabricate outrageously. She only had to plant a few seeds. Concern, unease, risk, and the town would water the shadow she wanted to grow. On the drive home, I understood the most important thing. Darren's petition wasn't the first step. It was the last. The first step was getting the community to look at me with doubt, so that when the court file appeared with phrases like cognitive decline, in need of protection, risk of living alone, the judge would subconsciously believe it was something everyone in Silver Pine Ridge had known all along. At that point, any protest I made could be interpreted as agitation, instability, or aggression. When I reached home, I stood at the door for a long time. The 2-story wooden house Helena and I built with months of hourly wages looked like a glass cage. Anyone could look in, examine, and judge. One misstep of mine could become evidence. One light left on could be labeled a sign of confusion. And that was when I understood. Before the court judged me, all of Silver Pine Ridge already had. I was no longer Ray in their eyes. I was the old man with a problem, someone who needed supervision, control, a character crafted from a few soft sentences of Lydia's, and the collective silence of familiar faces across 4 decades. That afternoon, the sky over Silver Pine Ridge dropped a low sheet of clouds, as if ready to press down on my roof. I was sitting in the living room, slowly folding the documents Darren had filed with the court, when the door was knocked 3 times. Not loud, but firm enough for me to know instantly this wasn't a neighbor or a mail carrier. When I opened the door, a woman in her mid-30s stood on the porch. She wore a dark blue coat with a small badge from the Oregon Adult Protective Services pinned to the collar. Brown hair tied back, a face without expression, professional to the point of coldness. Mr. Raymond Colt. Yes, she held out her ID. I'm Janet Morris, Adult Protective Services. We received a report from the community and from your family. If you agree, I'll conduct a standard evaluation. If you refuse, the court may issue a mandatory order. No threats, no insults, just a bare truth. This was the legal route to building a case for incapacity. I nodded. Go ahead. I'll fully cooperate. Janet stepped inside. She didn't look at the photos on the wall, didn't notice the fire suppression models I'd designed, didn't ask about Helena. Her eyes scanned like an error detector, searching for something to record, not something to understand. She sat at the kitchen table and opened a clipboard. Mr. Colt, I'll ask some basic questions. What have you eaten today? I thought for a second. Coffee. I wasn't hungry. Janet's pen moved, light but sharp as a blade. Are you taking any medications? Blood pressure pills? 1 each morning, never missed a dose. She nodded and wrote. Do you know what day it is? Friday, the 27th of October, 2025. Her face didn't change, but I knew my answer was being matched to a cognitive assessment form. And who is the current president? I answered clearly. She wrote again, offering no reaction, a silence between. Two strangers, but heavy as an interrogation. Then Janet stood. I need to check the living environment now, just to ensure you're living safely. I walked behind her. She opened the refrigerator, a few food trays, a carton of eggs, some vegetables, and a bottle of water. Neat, but not abundant. How often do you buy groceries? Every 3 days. I don't like food spoiling. She didn't reply, just closed the door. She checked the medicine cabinet, counts, expiration dates, usage patterns. Everything is orderly, except for the slightly old razor. Finally, Janet entered my bedroom. The bed is unmade. The pillow is still shaped to my head. On the bedside table, Helena's framed photo leaned slightly, as if someone had touched it last night. Janet wrote a line, unkempt sleeping area. I looked at the words, neat, cold, not judgmental but devastating, and for a moment I wasn't in that room anymore. I saw Helena, thinner but still gentle, lying in the hospice bed in this very spot for 4 years. I saw the IV bags, the wool blanket she loved, the schedule chart I used to mark every 2-hour medication, day, night, without missing a single dose. I saw myself never leaving the room for more than 10 minutes, a lifetime of care reduced to a single word. Unkempt. I swallowed hard. Janet turned back to face me, asking the sharpest question in the APS forms. Mr. Colt, do you believe your family is conspiring against you? This was a trap. I knew it. She knew I knew. If I told the truth, that Darren and Lydia were building a case to seize control of my assets, I would be labeled paranoid. If I said no, I would erase the very awareness I needed to prove in court. I took a long breath. Ms. Morris, I said slowly, I believe I have the same right to privacy every citizen has. But I do not think anyone is following me or plotting to harm me. I only feel my family situation is being misunderstood. Janet paused her pen for 1 second, just one, as though she hadn't expected such a careful answer. Then she continued writing. Do you agree to undergo a full cognitive evaluation by a licensed psychologist? This is your choice, not mandatory. I looked straight at her. I request the evaluation, the most thorough, the most rigorous, the most comprehensive your office can provide. For the first time during the entire visit, Janet lifted her head slightly, eyes showing a hint of surprise. I have nothing to hide, I continued. If someone is crafting a narrative about my mental state, then I want the light to fall exactly where it should. Janet closed the folder. All right, we'll schedule it within the next few days. The door shut behind her, leaving the house in absolute silence, but no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of a man who understood that the enemy didn't just want his money. They wanted to strip away his capacity, his dignity, his right to live independently. And I had just opened the first door leading toward the light, proving I had never been confused, never declined, never taken a single wrong step. 3 days after the home evaluation, I received a call from APS. Janet's voice was steady, revealing nothing. Mr. Colt, our clinical psychologist is available. You can come to the Silver Pine County Medical Center at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I agreed immediately. I wanted everything to move as quickly as possible, before Darren could build any more stories. The next morning, the sky was unusually clear, sunlight cutting through the pine ridge like slicing the road into cold, bright segments. I arrived at the medical center on time. The evaluation room was at the end of the hall, where neon light washed over the tile floor in a colorless glow. The psychologist was Harold Finch, a man with neatly kept silver hair, sharp eyes without harshness. He shook my hand and opened the file. Mr. Colt, today I'll conduct a series of standardized tests. They don't measure intelligence, but coherence of cognition, attention, and stability of thought. I nodded. We'll start with the 5-word recall. He read 5 words. Bridge, clock, apple, green, dog. I repeated them immediately. He wrote it down. Then came the subtract 7s test. From 100, subtract 7 continuously until I tell you to stop. 89, 82, 75, 68, 61, 54. My voice was steady without a stumble. Finch only nodded, writing smoothly. Next was the clock test, one of the most important assessments. He handed me a blank sheet. Please draw a clock and set the hands to 11:50. I drew the circle, marked the numbers clearly, and placed the hands where they belonged. He observed closely. Someone off by even a few degrees could reveal visual spatial disruption. Very good, he said. Let's continue with a logical sequence. Tell me the reasonable order for preparing a simple breakfast. I listed each step. Open the curtains, boil water, prepare the coffee, toast the bread, set out the dishes, and check the outlets. No missing steps, no reversed order. At the end, Dr. Finch closed the folder. Now repeat the 5 original words, he said. I recalled them instantly. Bridge, clock, apple, green, dog. He studied me for a few seconds, weighing body language, clarity, attention, then allowed himself a small smile. Mr. Colt, your results are nearly perfect. Your cognition ranks among the highest for someone in their 70s. No memory decline, no disorganized thinking, no signs of paranoia. I will state clearly, fully competent, no cognitive impairment. I stayed silent for a moment, feeling a weight drop from my chest. Not because I doubted myself, but because someone had finally seen the truth through a professional lens. This report, he continued, will be sent directly to APS. After they close the case, all documents will be forwarded to the court. I stood and shook his hand. For the first time in weeks, I felt a breath leave me without strain. 3 days later, Janet called again. The APS case is closed. The full report will be transmitted to the court this week. Good luck, Mr. Colt. The way she said good luck sounded routine, but I heard a thin layer of respect beneath it. Thin but real. I thanked her and hung up. A spark of hope flickered in my mind. Maybe Darren would stop. Maybe once he saw this report, he would feel ashamed enough to withdraw the petition. I wanted to believe that. Helena always believed in the return of conscience, and I still carry the habit of trusting the things she once trusted. But the next day, Peterson, the former attorney of a friend and now my temporary advisor, called. His voice was low, edged with frustration. Ray, I just reviewed the documents they submitted to the court. I froze beside the window. They did not include the APS report, Peterson said slowly. They only submitted the complaint, the narrative about you being forgetful, leaving the stove on, getting lost. They intentionally withheld the conclusion. My grip tightened on the windowsill. The court hasn't seen the evaluation results? Correct. And if no one says anything, the judge will read only Darren's petition and the family statements. That alone is enough for them to request temporary guardianship. I inhaled sharply, chest tightening as if wrapped in cold wire. Peterson continued, his voice turning to steel. Ray, this isn't a misunderstanding anymore. This is a strategy. They want the court to see only half the story, the half that helps them. I looked out toward the road leading down to Silver Pine Ridge. The fog was lifting, sunlight cutting through like a thin blade. Darren didn't want to stop. He wanted to win. And to win, he was willing to bend the truth I had protected my entire life. That afternoon, I went to Peterson's office, and the sky over Silver Pine Ridge had settled into a flat gray, like the surface of a winter lake. His office sat on the second floor of an old red brick building, its glass windows always reflecting the distant mountain range. Peterson was not the kind of lawyer who performed. The way he stood, the way he adjusted his glasses, the way he turned a page all carried the patience of a man used to handling cases full of hidden corners. On his desk today was a thick file, clipped in a black cover. He pointed to it. Ray, you need to see this. I sat down. Peterson opened the file, revealing a stack of documents bearing the High Plains Machinery logo, the company Darren had once worked for before he resigned. Turns out it wasn't voluntary at all. My PI just received a response from their legal department, Peterson said, and they cooperated quickly because the company is currently running an internal investigation into financial misconduct. He handed me the first page, a termination letter, the reason typed clearly. Falsification of travel logs and unauthorized reimbursement claims. Below was the HR director's signature and seal. Peterson flipped to the next page. The restitution agreement. The amount Darren owed, $5,200. Each item listed. Altered work hour logs, edited travel records, invalid reimbursement requests. I stared at the page, my heartbeat not faster but somehow slowed. This is from last year? I asked. Yes, and here's the real key, Peterson said, lowering his voice. They're willing to testify because they want to show Darren's misconduct wasn't an isolated incident. The room fell silent for a moment. I could feel it clearly. Helena had seen this 12 years ago, and I had covered it. Peterson opened the file again, this time to the credit reports the PI had legally gathered from civil court filings and public records. Lydia, he said slowly, has a total of $62,000 in credit card debt, plus $24,000 in unpaid medical debt. I straightened in my chair. All within 18 months, he continued, and here's the part that sent them into panic. Peterson handed me a screenshot of an email from a real estate company in Boulder, Boulder Crest Realty, offer pending. A small line beneath it read, down payment required, $850,000 USD. I closed my eyes for a moment. Darren had spoken of the future house, but I never imagined it was that large, and now everything connected too clearly to deny. Ray, Peterson said, they want that house badly enough to build an entire narrative about you. A very convenient narrative. You're confused, you can't manage your finances, you forget bills, you don't remember what you bought at the supermarket. They lay the groundwork, then request temporary guardianship. If granted, they can transfer assets, sell property, take out loans, everything under the justification of acting in your best interest. I said nothing. Peterson stayed quiet too, giving me time to look at the pieces I had refused to face. Finally, he slid another stack of papers toward me. This is what I've spent 2 weeks on, he said. I reconstructed the entire timeline, down to the exact days, to prove that Darren's actions were deliberate, not born out of genuine concern. I looked down, Darren and Lydia drowning in debt, job loss, medical expenses, credit cards maxed out, and a house requiring an $850,000 down payment. To reach that goal, they spread rumors that I was confused, filed for guardianship, and deliberately hid the psychological evaluation proving I was fully competent. Peterson set his pen down. Do you see it, Ray? It's all a plan, I said, my voice rough. Exactly, he replied. And that plan has cracks. They forgot that the truth leaves traces, and I've gathered enough traces to expose them in court. I looked toward the window. The mountains in the distance were fading into the evening mist. The months Helena spent in hospice in our bedroom flashed in my mind. She once said, "Don't let your silence ruin the boy." Today I saw that her words weren't just true, they were prophetic. Peterson closed the file. His voice wasn't loud, but every word carried weight. Ray, it's time you stood up for yourself. And in that moment, I understood. I wasn't merely defending myself. I was preparing to reveal the truth about the son I had protected my entire life. When Peterson shut the file, the room fell so still it felt like every sound was trapped between the pages. In front of me lay the full structure of a scheme, not impulsive, not mistaken, but intentional, layered with debts, fabricated claims, and calculated steps. From here on, Peterson said, pushing his glasses up his nose, they won't hide anymore. The next step will be to craft an emotional narrative for the court. Be ready, Ray. They're going to turn you into the villain of your own life. I nodded, though I couldn't tell whether it was agreement or just a reflex to hearing what I had long suspected. I left the office and drove back toward Silverpine Ridge in the late afternoon, the mountain road stretching ahead, pine shadows falling long across the pavement like quiet verdicts. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room beside Helena's photo, watching the porch light flicker in the wind, realizing by tomorrow I would no longer be Ray in the eyes of the community. They had already heard Darren and Lydia's story, while I had yet to speak a single word. Monday morning, I stepped into Stillwater County Court feeling like I was walking onto a stage where the props were already set, and I was the only one without a script. And just as Peterson warned, everything had been prepared far more carefully than I imagined. On the morning of the temporary hearing, the cold in Silver Pine Ridge was sharp enough that every breath turned into thin strands of smoke. I walked into the courtroom feeling as if I had stepped into a bad play where every actor knew their lines, except the only audience member, me. Stillwater County Court wasn't large. Wooden benches arranged in 2 rows, the smell of old varnish mixed with body heat, creating a thick pressing air that made anyone sitting long feel short of breath. A scattering of onlookers filled the seats, a few curious neighbors, 3 members of the community group who had commented under Lydia's post, and an older couple I didn't recognize. All of them looked at me as though I really were the dangerous old man described in that post. Then the door opened. Lydia walked in first, and in 2 seconds, I understood she had prepared an entire month just to stage this moment. She wore a black dress, not mourning black, but the sort of black worn by people who want to appear dignified in public. In her hand was a white lace handkerchief, the kind not meant for real tears, but to display fragility. Every step was calculated, slow, light, as if her heart were breaking, but she was forcing herself to remain composed. She glanced around, sighed softly, just loud enough for the first row to hear, then dabbed the corner of her eyes. There were no tears, only the gesture. Behind her, Darren kept his head bowed, fingers interlaced at his waist. At a glance, he looked like a man exhausted from worrying for his father, but I knew that posture, the stance of someone measuring every reaction in the room, waiting to see who leaned his way. They sat at the petitioner's table. Their lawyer, young with hair slicked back like polished plastic, placed a stack of papers on the table, bowed to the judge, and began the opening with a voice so soft it bordered on artificial. Your Honor, my clients are deeply heartbroken to be here today. They only want to protect the father they love. Lydia lifted the lace handkerchief again, pressing it softly to her eyelids, exactly like an actress matching her cues to the stage lights. Darren tightened his hands, producing a faint crack, as though barely holding back profound anguish. I watched them, and for a moment I didn't feel anger. I felt cold. Cold is the way one feels standing among wax statues in a museum, where every expression is sculpted with tools, not emotion. Their attorney began reading the statement they had prepared. In the past 3 months, Mr. Colt has repeatedly forgotten to lock his doors, left his stove on, and most concerning, there was a serious incident, a gas leak in the kitchen that caused panic in the neighborhood. Fortunately, Darren arrived just in time. Several spectators raised their hands to their mouths. Another shook his head, whispering, "Too dangerous. He's not lucid anymore." The room rippled with murmurs like water struck by stones. I stayed silent, closing my eyes for a single beat. My home had used an induction stove for 7 years. Darren himself had helped me install it. A gas leak was impossible. Impossible. But in court, the truth mattered less than the feelings people believed it. The lawyer continued piling on. Darren had to drive over at midnight and break into the house out of fear for his father's safety. And here is a video from a neighbor's camera showing Mr. Colt stepping outside barefoot at 2 a.m., appearing disoriented and directionless. Lydia held her breath, lowered her handkerchief into her lap, and bowed her head, as if she couldn't bear another ounce of sorrow. I didn't know who filmed that video. Perhaps Agnes's door camera, or someone who wanted to help the community stay aware. The entire room now leaned toward their side. People looked at me not as the man who had fixed hundreds of porches for families around Silver Pine, but as a potential danger. The judge observed me, said nothing, only wrote. I glanced toward Darren. He didn't look back, his shoulders folded in, the exact posture of a child, bearing the burden to protect his family. And Lydia? She raised her eyes. At the exact moment, sunlight slipped through the high window, making the lace handkerchief glow like a stage prop placed under a spotlight. She dabbed her eyes again. I breathed slowly. Half the room believed them. The other half wanted to believe, because tragedy is easier to swallow than the truth, that a child could push his own father to the brink. As the whispers swelled, one thought filled my mind. They're building an impression to set the stage for the main hearing. They were constructing an image of me as someone no longer capable of living independently. So when the next phase arrived, the court would already see the role I was meant to play. At the end of their argument, I looked at them and thought, if Helena were alive, she would recognize this scene instantly. A public humiliation orchestrated by the same boy I held in my arms when he was 3 years old. The court recessed. The spectators drifted out as though they had just watched a sad film. I remained seated, not standing, not reacting. Only one truth echoed in my head. They're not just performing in court. They're preparing to bury me alive with their words. As soon as Lydia stepped down from the witness stand, the lace handkerchief still trembling faintly in her hand, as if not yet absorbed into the air, Peterson rose. Not hurried, not showy, just a small adjustment of the buttons on his vest was enough to make the entire courtroom fall still. Your Honor, he said, voice low, to ensure completeness, I move to consolidate the civil and guardianship matters, because today's hearing must realistically assess the suitability of the proposed conservator. Judge Whitman lifted her head, her cold gray eyes cutting across the petitioner's table like a blade sliding over glass. She considered for a beat, then nodded. Approved. Proceed. The moment she said it, Peterson turned and pointed lightly at Darren. I call Mr. Darren Colt to the stand. The room shifted. Small sounds, fabric brushing benches, someone swallowing, a collective instinct when the person standing next may blur the line between truth and fiction. Darren stood, swallowing hard, his hand gripping his jacket sleeve, trembling a little. He walked toward the stand wearing a half-stricken, half-duty-bearing expression, the look of a man burdened by the responsibility of protecting his family. I watched my son walk past, each step dragging slightly as if stuck to the floor, and I knew, inside, he was suffocating with uncertainty. But Peterson gave no hint of an attack. Instead, he began so gently that the room almost believed this was just a casual conversation. Mr. Darren, Peterson said, when you filed for guardianship, you stated that your father could no longer manage his own finances. Is that truly what you believe? Darren gripped the wooden edge. Yes, I only want to protect my father. The line was pre-rehearsed, clean, agreeable, digestible. Peterson nodded as if sympathetic. I understand. Let's review a few dates for clarity. The air in the courtroom shifted instantly. Lydia rotated slightly, stiffening. Snyder, their lawyer, raised an eyebrow, sensing something drifting off script. Peterson opened the folder, but didn't pull out a single exhibit. He simply looked at Darren with an expression dusted in cold glitter. June 10th, he said slowly. You went to your father's home while he was away at a cardiology appointment in Denver. You stated it was to pick up mail. Darren nodded. Yes. And how long were you inside the home? Darren licked his lips. About 10-15 minutes. Peterson didn't challenge him. He simply tilted his head. You're certain? Darren froze for a very brief beat. Yes. Peterson continued, steady as a clock. On July 2nd, you also entered your father's home while he was at the veterans meeting. This time, you said it was to inspect the heating system. Darren answered quickly. It's a mountain house. Broken heat is dangerous. I just wanted to make sure it was fine. Peterson still didn't strike. He only asked, "And you didn't take anything from the house?" Darren shook his head harder than usual. "No, absolutely not." Judge Whitman set down her pen and looked up at him. One glance, and I saw Darren recoil just slightly. Peterson advanced one step. "Mr. Darren, can you explain why both occasions you entered your father's home happened to be times when he was completely absent?" Darren inhaled sharply. "Just a coincidence." "A coincidence?" Peterson repeated, dangerously soft. "And right after these two coincidences, you began telling people in Silverpine that your father was no longer lucid. Also a coincidence?" Darren's complexion paled. Snyder rose. "Objection. Argumentative." Judge: "Overruled. The witness may answer." Darren swallowed. I was just worried. My father's been forgetful." Peterson turned instantly, shifting the ground. "Do you have any evidence that your father is incapacitated? Or is this speculation?" Darren's jaw hardened. He mixes up dates and times. Leaves lights on." Peterson placed both hands lightly on the podium, leaning in just enough that the entire room held its breath. "But you didn't mention that your father passed a cognitive evaluation with near-perfect scores. Any reason you forgot to include that report in your filing?" A ripple ran through the room. Darren clenched his hands so tightly his knuckles went white. I didn't handle the paperwork." Lydia submitted it. The speed of the deflection made a few spectators exchange uncertain glances. Peterson straightened, closing the folder. "I'm not concluding anything today," he said, eyes locked onto Darren, "but the timeline you've just confirmed will be extremely important when we analyze the true intent behind this guardianship petition." Silence dropped like a stone. I looked at my son and saw the moral mask he had carefully crafted begin to fracture, hairline cracks spreading under the courtroom lights. He wasn't collapsing. Peterson wasn't aiming to crush him yet, but anyone perceptive could see the mask had shifted, and the stage they built for themselves was beginning to tilt under the weight of the truth. Gerald Peterson returned to his seat and set the folder down with a soft click that made Darren flinch. Their performance had begun to crack. When Darren stepped down from the stand with a face paler than the courtroom would, I knew Peterson had saved the hardest blow for last. He rose, adjusted his cuff like a master craftsman preparing to deliver the final strike to a stone already cracked. "Your Honor," he said, his voice not loud but strong enough to pull every breath in the room toward him. "At this stage, we must consider not only testimony, but verifiable evidence." Snyder shifted. Lydia clutched her lace handkerchief tight, her eyes flickering like someone who sensed smoke before seeing flames. Peterson opened his black case and pulled out the first paper, plain, unadorned, not dramatic. A letter from Northfront Credit Union. "This," he said, lifting it for Judge Whitman to see, "is a $20,000 online loan application submitted on October 12th, under the name Raymond Colt." The judge looked up, her gaze sharp as a blade. Peterson continued, "More importantly, the application uses Mr. Colt's correct Social Security number and birth date, along with security answers that match exactly." He turned toward Darren. "Do you have an explanation for why your father's personal information was used to apply for a loan on the very day you claimed he was no longer capable of managing his finances?" Darren went rigid, his lips trembling into a crooked line. Maybe someone hacked? Hacked?" Peterson let out a thin smile. "On the same day you told two friends, 'My dad won't need the house much longer.' Quite the coincidence." A soft hiss rose from the back row. Snyder shot up to object, but Judge Whitman waved him down. "Sit. Mr. Peterson, proceed." The second document came out. Not a bank form this time, but a signed statement from Agnes Winters, my neighbor of 40 years. Peterson read it word for word without embellishment. "I saw Mrs. Lydia Colt leaving Mr. Raymond's home carrying a beige canvas bag filled so heavily with papers that the straps were stretched. Lydia lurched to her feet. I was only helping clean. Peterson didn't look at her. Cleaning by removing another person's documents from their home? The room stirred. Lydia squeezed the handkerchief so hard her knuckles whitened. Snyder signaled for her to sit, but her face was already burning red, peeled open under the courtroom lights. Peterson withdrew the third page. This is the termination letter from High Plains Machinery, he said, his voice turning metallic. Mr. Darren Colt was terminated for falsifying travel expenses and using the company card for personal purposes. Peterson flipped the page. Attached is the restitution agreement for $5,200. Each word landed like another slab of concrete on Darren's back. The man who once played the role of the dutiful son was shrinking, eyes reddening, forehead damp. But Peterson still wasn't finished. He turned to the judge. And finally, we must correct a key piece of testimony, the alleged gas leak. Lydia's hands locked together, her shoulders trembling. Peterson presented a color photograph of my kitchen, featuring a modern induction stove, black glass surface, and no gas burners at all. This is Mr. Colt's kitchen, photographed by a Stillwater County inspector last week. This is the inspection report confirming no gas system present. The stove is fully electric. Peterson lowered the image. So, Mrs. Lydia, how exactly did a kitchen with no gas fill with the smell of a leak? Lydia opened her mouth, but nothing came out. A few spectators drew back in their seats, embarrassed on her behalf as her staged performance collapsed in full view. Judge Whitman set down her pen and exhaled sharply through her nose. Mrs. Lydia, she said slowly, would you like to amend your testimony? Lydia looked around, searching for an exit among a sea of eyes now fixed on her. No words came, and that was the moment. The mask of the devoted daughter-in-law cracked in public, leaving her exposed at the center of a humiliation far sharper than any scolding. Peterson snapped the file shut with a crisp, ringing click. At this point, he said, we have a clear pattern. Identity theft loan applications, a neighbor witnessing removal of documents, an employment termination for fraud, and false testimony about a gas leak, all following the same trajectory. He looked directly at Darren and Lydia, intent to misappropriate. The courtroom fell into a silence so heavy it felt physical, the kind that arrives only when the truth of a story has just been ripped into daylight before dozens of witnesses. That moment dropped into the room like a heavy object hitting the floor, every fabricated piece stripped away in public, leaving no one able to pretend they didn't see what had happened. As the courtroom settled after the earlier evidence had been laid bare, Peterson unlocked his black case and pulled out a thick, dark blue ledger, its cover embossed with the words Colt Helena Aerodynamics Legacy Trust. The overhead lights gleamed on the smooth finish of the book, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. From the petitioner's bench, Lydia leaned forward like someone catching sight of a shining lure. Darren sat motionless, shoulders slumped, as if he had just walked up a long incline. Peterson placed the ledger on the clerk's desk with a heavy, deliberate thud, just enough to remind everyone this was no ordinary document. Your Honor, he said, this trust was established in 1991, when Mr. Colt and Mrs. Helena sold their aerodynamic alloy technology to Axion Aerospace. Current valuation, $36.5 million. Snyder jerked to his feet. That amount, Judge Whitman lifted a hand. Sit down. We are still within the scope of guardianship and suitability analysis. Peterson nodded, flipping open the inside page, each binder ring sliding like a rehearsed score. What makes this document important, he said, is not the number, but the inheritance conditions. He rotated the ledger so the judge could clearly read the bold section. Judge Whitman put on her glasses and leaned in. Within seconds, the temperature in the courtroom seemed to shift. She looked up. The assets in this trust cannot be divided, cannot be modified by the court, and cannot be forcibly reassigned. The court may only determine whether the trustee is acting in accordance with the original terms. She turned to the next page. Section 4, Article B. Her voice was steady, impartial, but cold as silverpine wind in winter. Any direct heir who wishes to assume managerial authority or receive disbursements must meet 2 conditions. 1. Demonstrate 10 consecutive years of stable financial competence with no significant negative credit events. And 2. Must have no history of fraud, misappropriation, falsification, or involvement in criminal investigation. Each clause struck like a hammer on metal. The judge closed the ledger and looked directly at Darren. Mr. Colt's son meets how many of these conditions? The room held a single suspended breath. Darren bowed his head so deeply I could only see the crown of his hair. Peterson did not need to say a word. Everyone knew the answer, the judge concluded herself. Not a single criterion. Lydia shot to her feet like a spring released after being wound too tightly. The lace handkerchief dropped to the floor, forgotten. No, that can't be right. He's the son. He's entitled. This is family money. Her voice sliced through the courtroom, shattering its strained decorum. Some spectators turned away in discomfort. Others stared openly, watching the final unraveling of a character who had been performing nurtured virtue for months. Snyder tugged at Lydia's arm, whispering something, but she shook him off violently. 36.5 million. We have a right. He is blood. I have the right to know how much we're getting. Every word peeled off another layer of the devoted daughter-in-law mask she had worked so hard to craft. Judge Whitman leaned back, her gaze icy. Mrs. Lydia Colt, this trust does not grant you any rights, and Mr. Darren Colt disqualified himself the moment he engaged in financial fraud and identity misuse related to loan applications. Lydia opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Darren looked like a man who had been drained of all air. The judge continued. Legally, Mr. Colt owes no explanation for why his son receives nothing. The trust dictates that outcome. The court merely confirms it. Peterson closed his case, voice low. Your Honor, what I wish to highlight is this. The guardianship petition was not motivated by concern for Mr. Colt, as portrayed by the petitioners. They accessed trust-related documents before the court even scheduled a hearing. Their motive, clearer than ever. A thin ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Quiet, but enough for Lydia to feel the shift. The judge tapped her gavel lightly. Order! Her gaze swept across the petitioners one final time. Lydia looked down, fingers twisted so tightly, red welts rose across the skin. Darren sat stiff as lumber, out of arguments, out of performance. In the end, their pretense, laid bare by their own actions, collapsed in the center of the courtroom. Judge Whitman reviewed the documents on her bench, each page turning like the sound of final doors about to close. The courtroom was so silent that one could hear the faint creak of wooden seats whenever someone shifted. She struck the gavel once, not loudly, but with enough weight to pull every gaze toward the bench. We will begin with the civil claim of $850,000, she said, her voice steady and firm as the stone face of Silverpine Mountain. This lawsuit is based on the allegation that Mr. Raymond Colt promised financial support and then refused without justification. But after reviewing all evidence, from personal fraud to identity misuse, the court concludes the plaintiff's claim has no legal basis. She set her pen down, ending any suspense. The complaint is dismissed with prejudice. It may not be refiled. A ripple of sound moved through the public benches, then faded as the judge continued. Regarding the guardianship petition, she said, her gaze shifting from the file to Darren, the competency evaluation shows Mr. Raymond Colt is fully lucid. His responses, reasoning, and memory all score in the highest percentile for his age. Therefore, the guardianship request is denied immediately. Snyder stared down at his papers, hands trembling faintly. Darren closed his eyes for a moment, his shoulders collapsing as if drained of their final reserve. The judge did not look at him, but turned to Peterson. Regarding the Colt Helena Aerodynamics Legacy Trust, I instruct the BOW trustee to issue a formal declaration confirming that Mr. Darren Colt no longer meets any of the ethical criteria. The court cannot alter the trust conditions. It can only certify the trustee's actions. Peterson nodded slightly. That order, as a matter of law, was the period at the end of the sentence. Darren opened his eyes, his pupils hollow, the look of someone watching his house collapse from the inside with no voice left to call out. Not noise, not shouting. His silence was what chilled me. The judge went on, her tone dropping one level. As for the fraudulent actions, identity misuse, and false statements made before this court, this is not a criminal trial. However, the file will be forwarded to the district attorney's office for review of potential charges. She emphasized each word. This is standard procedure. The court is not issuing an arrest warrant at this time. Lydia shot upright as soon as the sentence ended, as if realizing the room she believed safe was actually burning beneath her feet. Her lace handkerchief fell, her heels striking the tile with sharp, brittle echoes. "No, you don't understand," she cried, her voice cracking like shattered glass. "We only wanted to keep the money in the family. We have the right—" Snyder yanked at her arm, but she tore free, her eyes wild with panic and anger, like a cornered animal that suddenly realizes it misjudged the terrain. Finally, she stormed out of the courtroom, moving so fast it was nearly a run. The heavy wooden door slammed behind her with a pent-up thud. No one followed. No one called her name. The months-long performance Lydia had staged ended with a single exit, fleeing from the truth that had finally spotlighted her. Darren remained seated, unmoving, no tears, no excuses, just the collapse of a man realizing he had walked too far down a road with no return. I looked at him, no bitterness, no triumph, not even disappointment. Only the feeling of a father watching his child erases the path back home. The judge struck the gavel one final time. "Court is adjourned. You may all leave." Peterson placed a hand on my back, light, like a reminder that the legal battle was over, though its echoes would linger long. As I rose, each step echoed through the wide, cold room, and I understood what I had lost wasn't money. It was the last thread of a bond I thought still held some warmth. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon light brushed the mountains with thin gold over the pines. I drew a long breath. Not victory, not defeat. Just the ending no one wants but must accept. Ray Colt, the man who stepped out of the courthouse, was no longer the same one who walked in that morning, and Darren Colt, still sitting behind, was no longer the boy I had spent a lifetime trying to protect. 3 months after the hearing, when the last snow on the slopes of Silverpine began to melt, I locked the door of the house I had lived in for nearly half my life with a feeling both light and strangely like shedding a familiar layer of skin. The final step on the wooden porch creaked softly, and that sound told me this place had once been home, once a sanctuary, but ever since the twisted story spread through the community, it was no longer a place where I could breathe freely. I placed the keys in an envelope and sent them to the realtor's office in town. The house found new owners within a few weeks, a young couple who loved the pines and wanted a fresh beginning. I was glad for them. As for me, I chose a different one, Santa Barbara, the place Helena once said, "If we ever find peace someday, it will probably be near the ocean." With my modest retirement savings, I bought a small apartment overlooking West Beach. Not luxurious, not spacious, but every morning when I opened the window, I met with the sound of waves and the gentle salt-filled air. The $36.5 million held in the Colt Helena Aerodynamics Legacy Trust remains untouched, reserved for those not yet born or still sitting in engineering classrooms somewhere, waiting for a door to open. Peterson coordinated with several universities to establish an aerospace engineering scholarship in Helena Colt's name, along with a research grant for applied alloy development. The money will go into what Helena valued most: knowledge and the people who create real worth. News about Darren and Lydia arrived steadily after 5 months. The district attorney's office officially opened a criminal investigation focusing on identity misuse, false statements, and financial violations related to the loan application. They hired a new attorney, sold nearly everything they had left to stay afloat, but still couldn't avoid landing on the court's monitoring list. Their marriage fractured. Lydia moved back to her hometown to stay with her sister, and Darren took odd jobs in a nearby town to chip away at minor debts. No one arrested them immediately, but the shadow of accountability stood behind them day after day, demanding explanations they had not yet found the courage to face. One afternoon, standing before the Santa Barbara shoreline, I opened my hand and let the wind slip through my fingers. The water glimmered silver in the distance, like the streak of light Helena used to admire in the forest. I thought of her, of the years we tried to build a solid foundation for our son, of my mistakes in shielding him too much, and of the one thing I finally got right. "Helena," I whispered, "at least I protected what you feared most, not letting wealth destroy a person's character." The waves brushed the shore lightly, an answer thin but enough. I no longer felt anger toward Darren, only regret. If only he had been stronger before ambition pulled him under. If only I had been firmer before the tragedy took shape. But as Peterson said the day he delivered the finalized trust documents, parents don't get to choose the final shape of their children. They can only try to give them the conditions. Character chooses its own direction. I watched a line of seagulls stretch across the sunset sky and felt my heart lighten like a page yet unwritten. My life won't have many long chapters left, but at least this one closed as it should. Just, clear, without bitterness. And if you're listening to this story, I want to ask you directly, do you think hiding assets to see the true character of one's children is the right thing to do? Or is it just a test too easily turned into fuel for greed? If you have thoughts, let me know in the comments, so I know you're still here with me. And if you want to hear more everyday stories of justice like this, give me a subscription. I truly appreciate it. Goodbye, and see you next time.